You know, for something named Merry-Go-Round, there sure are a lot of people who haven't had a very merry experience with Refraction Railway 5. And while I firmly believe this is one of the easier railways to complete, not that newer players are allowed a point of comparison, if you struggled, are struggling, or plan to struggle with Merry-Go-Round, or just here because I haven't uploaded a video in, geez, that's a while now, and you need something to eat your lunch to, I'm here to help with any and all of that. That being said, if you are just mindlessly going through my catalog of videos, I do need to mention that this video will contain spoilers for Kanto 7, and likely beyond. To 99% of you, this should not matter, but I feel like covering my bases. And since I hate doing intros, you probably hate listening to them, and you already know the premise of the video because you have working eyeballs, probably, let's cut to the chase and start talking about Railway 5 and how best to get through it. And normally this is where I would talk about this railway's unique gimmick for like 15 minutes, similar to Railway 4 with its extensive backup buff system, but there's actually not much in terms of preface this time around. The main thing that will make your runs significantly different from normal gameplay are the buffs given to you at the end of each wave of a section, as well as the fact that each section is 3 to 4 waves back to back. But I'll be talking about the buffs in order as they become available and relevant. The only hard requirements you should consider for this railway before even trying it is having 2 teams of properly leveled, around level 45 or 50, and Uptide 3 or Uptide 4, IDs. 2 teams are needed due to Section 2 completely locking you out of using IDs that were brought into Section 1, even IDs that were only brought on the bench. As well, 1 decent healing ego with a corresponding ID to use it with will make your railway experience more consistent, though even that is hardly required, more so just strongly recommended. By 2 teams, I don't necessarily mean 24 fully uptied and leveled IDs, though that will certainly make the railway easier. I don't think the average player should need more than 8 IDs per section, meaning 6 initially fielded IDs and 2 proper backup IDs. Accounting for the 1 free support ID that you should basically always be using, this means you need 14 usable IDs in total. Now, using some underleveled IDs isn't the end of the world, but lucky you, as soon as you complete Section 1, you can use some of the EXP tickets to level up, or if you're really in need of some absolute optimization, you can cosplay as an imperialist country and bring in your really weak IDs first and sacrifice them for the delicious natural resources in order to give you an advantage. Since you wouldn't really be able to fill up your backup slots with anything useful anyways, you may as well get something out of them. And if you're really desperate and have to use underleveled IDs quite a bit, I recommend using fast IDs if you can, since they are more useful than slow underleveled IDs, especially in Section 2. And to talk about Section 2, we first need to talk about Section 1, which consists of 4 waves. These fights are, in order, Herding Teddy Bear, Rose Hunter, 1 Class 3 of the Wrath, Sloth, and Gloom Pecatulums, and Sleeping Bag of a Bygone Day. Looking at all of these enemies and their weaknesses, there's only one standout sin affinity and or damage type across all these fights, and that is Wrath. Wrath is not very good against the Pecatula, but it is great for literally everything else. As the railway itself suggests, Envy, Pierce, and Slash are also effective here, and it's important to save your big blunt damage dealers for Section 2 anyways, and even though Pierce isn't good against Rose Hunter, I would say it is the single best damage type to build into, in case you're doing some weird mono damage type challenge run, not like I would understand what that's like. Outside of just damage types and sin affinity resistances, and hear me out when I say this, it's important that you have IDs that can clash well. Okay, well, duh. But what's more important is that you have IDs that can clash well early into a fight, either through accelerated SP gain or just really high skill floors. I may be getting a bit ahead of myself, but Herding Teddy Bear's rough expression of love skill can be used very often, and rolls a 16, which can be hard to consistently clash, and is actually annoying regardless of if you win the clash or not, but definitely gets far worse when you lose against it. Full Stop Office Heathcliff is great for this, since he'll get you through this first fight, and then probably be ready to leave and substitute in for an ID better suited for Rose Hunter once you are through the Teddy Bear. Liu Rodian and Liu Yisong are a great duo for this section, and adding Liu Ishmael to make a trio that fulfill each other's conditionals quickly also works out nicely, even if Liu Ishmael is mono blunt. Liu Yisong's SP healing makes it so basically everyone on your team has kind of accelerated SP gain, at least once 4 Wrath has been accrued, which shouldn't be too difficult. Status teams in general are also favored due to the merry-go-round of buffs to choose from, and yes, I am pretty sure this is the only actual merry-go-round theming in this railway, but I guess I can't really fault them considering Railway 3 was named Mirror Clock Orange Road, and I'm fairly certain that name was just because it was orange and shaped like a clock. Regardless, Bleed, Burn, Rupture, Charge, and Poise teams will all do pretty well, either due to favorable damage type and sin types across the IDs within those teams, or due to particularly strong buffs that can be taken for them. Of course, basically any assortment of IDs can be brought in, but I would strongly recommend against a dedicated sinking team in particular, due to Gloom being an absolutely abysmal damage type for this section. There isn't one particular ID that I would say is a high priority to take as a support ID, unlike the other two sections, but there are particular other IDs I recommend not using right now, and those are Zwei Ishmael, Wild Hunt Heathcliff, and Multicrack Faust. Using a bunch of your other strong IDs in Section 1, even if they are suboptimal, will most likely be okay if you have these 3 IDs, or as many of them as possible, saved for Section 2. But that's enough about generalizations. Let's talk about the first fight of the railway. Now, if you're like me, fighting Herding Teddy Bear was basically like fighting an entirely new abnormality, because its encounter in this Kanto 7 dungeon was underwhelming to say the least. Now, since it's the very first fight, and therefore you're forced to fight it without any ego resources or SP, it's slightly harder, and the debuffs it inflicts actually do matter, because the fight continues on for quite a while past it. Curse and Nails are annoying at worst in small amounts, but getting hit by an RNG attack power down on multiple IDs sucks, and God forbid if you allow your Nails and Bleed to stack up. The central gimmick of Herding Teddy Bear revolves around Faint Memories and the Expression of Love skill. Expression of Love is used almost every turn, and it is an incredibly weak Gloom blunt skill, but get used to seeing a lot of unbreakable coins. We are indeed living in a post-Kanto 7 world. If this skill is targeting an enemy without any debuffs, Rough Expression of Love, that skill I mentioned earlier, will be used the following turn. And if Faint Memories is lower than the amount of debuffs on the target, a Sad Embrace is used against that target next turn instead, which will stagger Herding Teddy Bear and give it too fragile for 2 turns. This leads to a pretty simple gameplay loop, where you're trying to win clashes in order to reduce the Faint Memories on Herding Teddy Bear since it reduces on clash win, while also balancing having at least one ID with a decent amount of debuffs that can clash with Expression of Love in order to stagger Herding Teddy Bear as much and as efficiently as possible, or you can literally ignore everything I've said and just kill it. Yeah, it isn't that hard to just brute force this fight if you can't be bothered, I would know. I did it twice before actually trying to play this fight the intended way, and then I got bored, forgot I was trying to play into the gimmick, and brute forced it again. It's that easy. Okay, one last small piece of actual advice for this fight. If you really want to minimize taking damage, Gloom and Wrath are the sin affinities that have unbreakable coins on them, so try to clash with Expression of Love with an ID that is not weak to either of those sins by default, or just use an ID that resists Blunt. Once you're through playing with toys, you'll be presented with a choice of 3 buffs: Refracted Mind, Gain Refraction, and Infliction Refraction. This is one of the only times in this railway where basically none of the options are bad, unless you don't plan to use any Poise or Charge IDs throughout the railway, especially since the downside to all of these buffs is the same +1 to enemy level. Refracted Mind is the easiest one to recommend in general, since 24 SP healing across 3 IDs is almost always useful. Though the biggest downside is making Wild Hunt Heathcliff and especially Endcorp Sinclair worse at getting their damage off, but if you're running Dawn Office Sinclair for this section with the other burn IDs, this is a fantastic buff to take. +1 to Poise and Charge count sounds really nice, but this is actually only a buff for Charge IDs, since later in this railway, there is a Poise buff that makes this one kind of obsolete. So if you're running a Poise team, or plan to run a Poise team later, this can be a bit of a waste. Infliction Refraction is just +1 to potency for the other 5 main statuses, which can be a pretty significant buff to IDs with a lot of small applications of their status, but also this is just good to take in general because, let's be honest, it's hard to avoid IDs that have any of these keywords. After you've chosen your buff, we're on to Rose Hunter. This is another very straightforward fight that ensnares one of your IDs each turn and forces you to kill the Barbed Lasso either with one of your skill slots or through AoE skills. Luckily, these Barbed Lassos will die to basically anything that isn't the weakest of weak 1 coin skills, so they don't ask much from you. There's literally zero reason to keep these alive, since allowing the Barbed Lasso debuff to stack up on turn start just leads to forced damage or even a stagger on turn end. Don't get greedy, you don't need to be fancy, just exercise your right to choose and abort those little leeches. Beyond that, this Tumblr sexy man really doesn't have anything too bad. Yes, his skills are stronger on average than the Herding Teddy Bear, but your SP is also hopefully full by this point, and even if it isn't, there is a good chance you took Refracted Mind and are well on your way to full SP. At worst, you might have to use a Zayn level Ego to clash against this particular Gluttony skill. Obviously, getting Rupture Count stacked onto you via Unbreakable Coins is frustrating, and this actually starts getting problematic once he's brought below 40%. This activates his passive, and you are inflicted with Rupture equal to your speed every turn, and the Barbed Lasso inflicts 2 stacks of itself on use, meaning you are taking 20 Gluttony damage for free with the ID that clashes against Snaring Lasso. Conveniently though, Rose Hunter's first stagger bar is at 45%, and the second one is at 25%. Now, we could just nuke him down after he's staggered for the first time if we have enough damage, but a strategy I find very useful that I don't think I've talked about is something I'll call stagger chaining. Basically, when the enemy is staggered, the natural instinct is to go all out to deal as much damage as possible. But when an enemy has 2 stagger bars that are relatively close to each other, it's better to bring the enemy very close to that second stagger bar, then get another stagger off at the start of the next turn, essentially giving you 3 turns of stagger off of 1. Using this completely bypasses the most annoying phase of Rose Hunter and invalidates a lot of enemies with similar stagger threshold setups, and we'll be using this a lot in the future. When doing this, it's better to do significantly less damage than you think you need to do than to accidentally go slightly over, since that just puts you in a way worse position than if you played it normally. This is not too relevant for this boss, but good to keep in mind and very useful if the opportunity arises. Following the Rose Hunter, the 2 buffs you didn't pick after Herding Teddy Bear will still be options for you, but you also get to choose from 6 new and more specialized buffs, those being Refracted Bleed, Refracted Sinking, Refracted Rupture, Refracted Burst, Refracted Charge, and Refracted Poise, whose little icon is 100% meant to have the pride symbol instead of gloom. I don't know how this got through Project Moon's rigorous quality assurance department, but I'm disgusted. Now, I'm sure you can guess that these buffs are very situation dependent, you kinda just pick them if you plan to run the associated team. Except the bleed one, cause good god, that is a terrible choice. 5x3 bleed to basically start an encounter is okay, I guess, though it's not guaranteed you'd even be able to keep up that initial bleed stack anyways, so at worst, it is just 15 damage to enemies. Now that is definitely not great. I also really like, and by really like, I mean really hate, the fact that this mediocre effect has a million conditionals. Like, only working on targets at max HP, okay, but also it can only work once per enemy, per part, per encounter. So what's the point of specifying that it only works on max HP targets? Either way, I've never taken this buff, it sounds awful on paper, and even if its description is wrong, all of the other status buffs are better with a much less potentially bad downside, even if there are ways to hard counter bleed effects later in the railway. Refracted Sinking and Poise are very similar in function, just more damage for doing what you'd already be doing, and Refracted Rupture is more skill power for merely daring to run a Rupture team, but hey, 2 final power is pretty good. And Devyat Rojin is a pretty strong ID in general if she is brought in as a backup after like full stop Heathcliff leaves or something. Refracted Burst is the only buff here that affects 2 archetypes, so if you're one of the 4 people who plan to take both a Burn and a Tremor team to this railway, then this is a no-brainer to take, since it is a Tremor Burst and Wrath damage equal to Burn at the cost of only 1 count, so yeah, that's just really good. Refracted Charge is arguably the best one, since it makes NV teams stronger over the course of the fight, while also just buffing every big charge skill's damage. So if you're really stuck and don't know what to take, and you have at least 1 charge ID with a skill that can spend A+ charge, this is a good bet. Now, the 3 Class 3 Pekatula. Now, initially, I wanted to skip this stage entirely, because there shouldn't be much to say. But, I am historically very good at finding things to say, and I am glad I am, because this stage can be surprisingly nasty. The most important thing to do for this wave is to focus down the Gloom Pecatulum. It has a passive that will inflict 5 sinking on 5 of your 6 sinners each turn. This isn't a problem, so long as you don't get hit. But unfortunately for you, we live in a post-Canto 7 world, so getting hit is inevitable. And this can come back to bite you in the ass on the last wave of this section, or even in this fight if you're not careful. Taking a big chunk of SP loss leads to dealing less damage, and taking more damage just by nature of not rolling heads consistently enough to clash, and this single ballin' as fuck motherfucker is another big reason I think sinking is really, really terrible for this part of the railway, since you cannot kill this thing. In addition, this attack, don't let this attack go through. Just use Ego, don't take the risk of rolling tails, it is not worth it. Outside of just the Gloom Pecatulum, the Sloth Pecatulum is a really terribly annoying wall if you don't offset this guard, which you can easily do by using a defensive skill to redirect the guard so that it won't trigger. And it won't get the 3 protection, alongside having damage taken, it'll only be 50% less damage taken. Thrilling enemy design. The Wrath Pecatulum is only intimidating if you have 6+ burn and get hit by the counter, or if you slip up and lose a clash to its strong multi-coiners. But other than that, it's the easiest one to nuke down due to its high up stagger threshold. This wave really is just playing the win clashes and exploit enemy weaknesses game, but a bad roll or a tails hit can lead to devastation. So remember your target priority and, get a little lucky. After this fight, you get another choice from these same set of buffs that I've mentioned before. This is the last buff you'll be able to take from this set, since the final wave of each section has its own set of buffs to choose from. And once you've chosen your buff that will surely be useful for you for the rest of the railway, Sleeping Bag of a Bygone Day, who I will just be calling the Sleeping Bag because I cannot be bothered to say it all aloud, nor type that every time in my script. This literal bag of bones is also surprisingly straightforward, starting with a bunch of poise and poise count that is lost when it loses a clash and is hit afterwards or takes an unopposed attack. Making Sleeping Bag lose poise count or poise potency is good for multiple reasons, though the most apparent benefit is making it lose some HP if it is at less than 10 poise potency or count in order to gain potency or count. But also, after a few turns, Sleeping Bag will use a bunch of this Unbreakable Envy skill, and while its base roll is close to negligible, poise and poise count can increase its clash value to be a bit annoying. Clashing and doing some unopposed attacks into the body when you can in the early turns should leave you in a good position, since the body is weaker than the head, and is the body part we need to break eventually anyways. These unbreakable coins are likely to activate a lot of sinking and or rupture on your sinners, but it shouldn't be enough to devastate you if the previous fights didn't go horribly wrong. Once the body breaks, a guy pops out. And like most humans, this guy is very susceptible to being slashed, pierced, or bludgeoned to death. This is helped out even more by him gaining too fragile the turn he comes out, making the turns with the person out by far your best times to do big damage. Shortly after this, you'll be given an abnormality check asking if you want to gain protection and be a little baby loser, or face the world head on like God intended, dealing more damage to Sleeping Bag in exchange for being hit harder on crit by Share the Pain, a powerful-ish 3-coin pride skill. And sure, yeah, either choice is fine, but I think I've made my bias pretty clear. And considering this is the last fight of the section, taking a bit more damage on a crit is nothing compared to the amount of damage you can put out on that turn. As for Share the Pain itself, just use an ego to clash it. It's simple as that. Essentially, don't let the giant health pool trick you into thinking this fight is a slog, since it's actually pretty short if you focus your damage into the body and then into the person when you get the chance. After Sleeping Bag, Section 1 is done. But you also get a choice from 3 powerful buffs. But I don't think the choice is too difficult here. You are given the choice between Weakness Destroyed, A Single Breath, and Nebulizer. These allow for 30% more damage on staggered targets or destroyed body parts, 30% more damage on ego skills, or literally just the entire Nebulizer Ego Gift, which is obviously great if you plan to run Poise. Now, if you don't plan to run Poise, you really only have two options here, and I think Weakness Destroyed is easily the better general option. A single breath certainly will help with making the upcoming Envy Pecatillum more consistent, but making your nuke turns significantly more potent is much better in my opinion. If you are an avid ego spammer, then take a single breath. On to Section 2, and this is where we are literally forced to reevaluate our team. I won't put every enemy from this section on screen, but to put it simply, you're gonna want primarily Blunt and a little bit of Slash. Sin Affinity damage weaknesses are all over the place, since 90% of the enemies you'll be facing through this section are Envy Pecatillum. Gloom and Envy are probably the best due to being good against quite a few of the base ego the Envy Pecatillum will have equipped, and being good or neutral against Shadow the Hedgehog. I already mentioned earlier some of the biggest standout IDs for this section. Multicrack Faust, Wild Hunt Heathcliff, and especially Zvyishmael, who is indeed the strongest Ishmael ID, and would have been the choice in that video I made if she wasn't released at the tail end of me editing it. Outside of the fact that all three of these are very good IDs, what makes these three in particular very good is having AoE Blunt's ego. Though admittedly, this is to varying degrees of effectiveness, I would still say it is the most important thing to have here. 12 out of 18 Envy Pecatillum, and especially the actually scary ones, are fatal to Blunt. So one good AoE Blunt ego can leave most of the field staggered, and though Slash isn't great for the Pecatillum themselves, having some Slash is nice for the last fight's minion enemies. Using your one support ID slot on any of those three is a good bet. And while Binds at Threadspin 4 is your quickest ticket out of Section 2, my biggest recommendation is still Zvyishmael, due to her ability to clash regardless of speed ranges. And also, she's who I used because I have Wild Hunt Heathcliff anyways, but it is really up to you. And speaking of speed ranges, fast IDs in particular are a useful commodity against Envy Pecatillum, so any ID that has easy access to haste or a high base speed range with some spammable ego is very viable here. This is why I mentioned having underleveled IDs, but ones with high speed ranges is useful enough, since they at least have a chance to get attacks off or redirect and tank attacks that would otherwise hurt actually valuable team members. Other than that, try to play into the buffs you chose in the previous section, which you can always see in the top right by clicking this question mark. Though, bear in mind, having lots of Blunt is still way more important than using that refracted poise buff you may have taken in a drunken stupor to dull the pain of playing railway content. Just play towards your strengths for this section, and when you start Section 2, you've got the worst two waves in this railway. Iron Strike into Rampage back-to-back is by far the most RNG-filled part of the railway, which easily makes it the part where you could be forced to reset the most, which is terrible. The first fight puts you up against the Firing Squad, also known as every ID with a gun. And this means that Full Stop Heathcliff, with his 3 Pierce power-up on turn 1, and often having 2 haste to add on to his terribly annoying 3 to 8 speed range, is an enemy we unfortunately have to deal with. He is absolutely the top priority to stagger, and luckily, it's not that hard considering how squishy he is. I'd recommend just resetting until your ID with an AoE Blunt ego is going faster than most enemies, and trying to fire that off. Now, Full Stop Hong Lu will also absolutely destroy you if Full Stop Heathcliff is on the field, since his target spotted activates on use, meaning if you win the clash, Heathcliff can still take a headshot on your Red Eyes Penitence Ryoshu and deal like 75% of her HP. Yes, this did happen on a 40% chance in my third run through this railway. How could you tell? Beyond turn 3, this fight should be solved. So long as you prioritize killing 1 or 2 of the Pecatillum so you have more actions than them, you should just snowball the rest of the fight. So just save yourself the trouble and don't be stubborn with your ego usage, since trying to get through this even with it can be pretty annoying. Of course, when Envy Pecatillum are brought up, I need to mention redirecting downwards. Considering your enemies will be using ego that can clash at ridiculous levels with actually high speed ranges, it's important to try and just stagger or kill that enemy before they can even fire off the ego. The best way to do this is to try and make your faster sinners attack the enemy and only actually clash with one of your slower sinners so that all those attacks go through unopposed before anything else. This works best if your slower sinner is the main target of the attack, and therefore can redirect the clash back down to themselves once you've set up the unopposed attacks. Obviously, if the enemy is way faster than your team, there's only 3 options. Win the clash with ego, or a really good skill, use Durante Pigrisha and cry about it later, or lose the clash and probably just lose. That is why I recommend resetting when you can, so that you don't play through a suboptimal run and have to reset later down the line. Now, I can already hear the flood of comments, so let me just address this now. What if you are one of many people across the world who are contractually obligated to use base Merceau in Section 2 of Railway 5, and don't worry, I was sure to test and make sure that he is indeed viable, though his low speed range unfortunately makes him a little bit of a liability. Even though the 2 main threats in this wave are still absolutely the full stop friends, just remember, Limbus Company is a game that hates your fucking guts, and will take any chance to remind you that LCCB Ishmael, despite being the slowest ID here, can still roll a 6 on speed. And we'll just so happen to use Blind Obsession on that same turn, and in that same instance, you will not roll a speed above a 5, and you will lose the 50-50 for her to hit tails, and you will have to reset due to accidentally bringing all Pierce Fatal IDs. A big part of this section is just accepting that some mistakes are gonna happen, and you're gonna take damage, even if it is absolute bullshit. That philosophy is even more apparent in the next wave, but before then, we have the best and most important set of buffs to choose from this railway, and no, that Discord ping was not from you, it was from me to get your attention. How dare you try to doze off during my lecture. There are 6 buffs to choose from for these next 2 nodes, and 3 of them are great, 2 of them are terrible, and 1 is just okay. Starting with the terrible ones, because getting angry increases my viewer retention, Lasting Battle Spirit and Wrathful Counter. Lasting Battle Spirit is a buff that focuses on buffing your backup IDs with an attack power-up and 30 SP on entry, as well as some ego resources. 1 attack power-up is pretty nice, putting you 1 above the enemies you're fighting in terms of clash power, except no, you aren't, because this buff makes itself a net neutral due to giving the enemies 1 clash power-up. Then, considering that this only applies to backup IDs, you are nerfing half your team by 1 clash power just to get some ego resources, SP, and a tiny bit of extra damage via attack power-up, and that's only if you actually need to use backup IDs. This is probably close to the worst buff in this railway, but Wrathful Counter isn't much better. Your IDs gain 2 offense level up when they're hit, which is nice and all considering Unbreakables make it impossible to get no value. The issue is that you are always hitting your enemies, and 4 times a turn, they randomly gain either 1 defense level up or 1 offense level up next turn when they are hit. This buff just adds a level of randomness, and can potentially add 1 1/3 of a clash power to an enemy. If you like the idea of this buff, just use Harpooner Heathcliff. Resource Reaping is a pretty mediocre buff. I would just consider it unnecessary, since 2 ego resources on kill isn't worthless, but you also shouldn't really be running out of ego resources in this railway anyways. The downside is negligible luckily, so taking this in case you are a certified ego spammer is fine. Then we have the big 3 buffs: HP Manipulation, Bloody Banquet, and Life or Death. HP Manipulation gives plus 25% max HP to all allies, and removes the first stagger threshold. This means many tank IDs just can no longer be staggered at all, and plus 25% max HP helps a lot to deal with the Unbreakables and potential ego tanking. Bloody Banquet is excellent sustain due to giving 10% of damage dealt back to you as healing, and most importantly, removing 3 bleed count on turn end for all allies. Now this isn't too important for this section, but trivializes the 3rd section. Life or Death has a significant downside of removing 25% max HP from all allies, but 30% more damage dealt is hard to deny. The order in which to take these isn't an exact science, especially since the buff you didn't pick will be available after the first node in Section 3, But my recommendation in general is to take HP manipulation first, which will hopefully make the next wave more consistent due to not staggering. If your health is in a really good position and you have confidence that you'll be able to just blitz through the next 12 NV Pecatolum, then Life or Death is a really good option too. Bloody Banquet I wouldn't take at this point, but we will get back to that later. And yes, you heard me right. Unlike the first wave, we have 12 NV Pecatolum to get through, with all 6 Kurakumo IDs starting off, then a bunch of people with varying levels of ego, and the middle IDs. I guess. Once again, Blunt is just far and away the best damage type. Most of the Kurakumo, as well as Dawn Office Sinclair and Magic Bullet Otis, are fatal to it, but having some slash is nice to get through the middle IDs, LCE Yi Song, and KK Ryoshu. AoE Blunt Ego is even more essential for the first turn of this wave due to the very real risk of 3+ Lust Resonance happening, which activates Ishmael and Heathcliff's passives. Ishmael can make the allies on the field that are adjacent to her have unbreakable coins with extra power, as well as making them unstaggerable. Or she can have 4+ Lust Resonance, and you can just lose the game, since everyone is unbreakable and cannot be staggered. If you see 4 Lust Resonance on your first turn of Rampage, I'm sorry, that's all I can really say, there's no real counterplay. Especially if Ishmael is using her skill 2 that same turn, in which case she says, fuck you, restart for free. Heathcliff is very tame in comparison, since he will just force you to take free damage when you hit his allies, but even more unavoidable damage just adds to the pile of shit RNG fest that the first turn of this fight is. Focusing down Ishmael with Lust Blunt or Sloth Blunt attacks is likely the most consistent way to make headway, as Vi Ishmael with the Christmas Nightmare Ego does pretty good work here, and I really recommend having her use her guard the turn before going into Rampage so she can always redirect attacks. Attack weight manipulation is also key to specifically focus Ishmael down, but I trust you know how that works, hopefully. Heathcliff is the second highest priority. Once again, Zwei Ishmael with her skill 3 in defensive stance will literally turn Kurakumo Heathcliff into dust, and from there, it doesn't matter all too much. Though do remember that Dawn Office Sinclair will unstagger if you kill 2 of his allies in the same turn due to immediately entering Ego form, so don't be caught off guard by that. No other one particular Pecatolum is super scary for anything besides Ego, and I don't have any more groundbreaking advice than what I've already said about redirecting downwards. Except, I will point out that all of Otis's Ego clash really high, so maybe try to get rid of her quickly. However, if there was ever a wave to use Durante on, it is this one, since going back through Iron Strike again is just annoying. And you don't have the advantage of being able to have action economy in your favor here, since when you kill one of the 6 initial enemies, you're just bringing another one in. Remember to check and exploit enemy Sin Affinity weaknesses, and be grateful that a lot of the new multi-coin Ego have been added, making some Sinners a lot less scary, and by Sinners I do specifically mean Ryoshu, because Thoracalgia is a huge downgrade from Red Eyes Open or 4th Match Flame in terms of clashing. After this wave, you should be taking either of the 2 buffs you have not taken from the good ones I listed. I would prioritize Life or Death over Bloody Banquet, but it is 100% a matter of preference, since Bloody Banquet basically assures you will eventually get through the last fight of the section via sheer attrition, whereas Life or Death makes certain aspects, like killing this fucker, quickly, much easier. And by this fucker, I of course mean Der Flushoots, whose name makes me feel like it's allergy season, and I'm just sneezing into my microphone like an idiot. Unlike every other abnormality in this railway, Der Gesundheit has a gimmick that you pretty much are forced to interact with. For the first couple of turns, the fight is simple clashes, with only some annoying unbreakable coins, except when his patterns change once below 75% HP, at which point he will summon 3 target dummies, one of which will be front and center, and have the stigmatized debuff. This enemy will always have an attack aimed at them, which will insta-kill them if it goes off, dealing damage to you and lowering your SP. There will also be an attack aimed at your ally with the slowest speed and lowest HP, who will also be stigmatized. Just be sure to clash this with an ally who is not stigmatized in order to put some Paralyze and Fragile onto him. Even if the Fragile isn't much use due to the shield, the Paralyze is still nice. Your goal in the fight now is to clash against problematic attacks, but also kill the enemy he plans to target before he can get to them. since that will cancel his attack and lower his targeting settings buff counter by 1. Once this reaches 0, he'll be staggered. The chip damage of some of these skills can be a problem, but of course, HP Manipulation and Bloody Banquet help out a ton with staving off staggering due to his chip damage, or, just flat out make it impossible, or near impossible to stagger during this fight. Without HP Manipulation in particular, this fight can kinda just screw you over with RNG, considering his unbreakable coins hit random targets, and if that just so happens to keep being your multi-crack Faust, who is Pierce and Pride Fatal due to using Fluid Sac, then it would be kinda difficult. It is important to mention that once there is only one G-Corp minion alive for him to kill, he'll use 2 of the target readjustment fires, 1 targeted at the enemy, and 1 at your lowest HP ally. Just like throughout the rest of the fight, these cannot be redirected. So be prepared with some kind of ego that clashes 26+ on this turn, since without it, you could just lose an ID, not like that is the end of the world. Once you have successfully stopped him from committing manslaughter by slaughtering the men yourself, he should be staggered, so it really is important to kill and even overkill the G-Corp minions so that he gets staggered and you're not completely devastated in terms of SP and HP. Since the Stigmatized phase starts when he is at 75% HP, and the first stagger bar is at about 40%, we can save his first actual stagger bar for the turn after this natural stagger occurs, and alongside a very convenient abnormality check that gives him 3 fragile and 2 damage down the turn following this natural stagger, he should be instantly staggered again, dealt a bunch of damage, and then just promptly killed that turn or the next. Life or Death makes this far more consistent, especially paired with Weakness Destroyed, but if you didn't take those, I trust whatever buffs you did take helped enough to avoid going through too many more turns of this fight. I'll end off this section by once again emphasizing the importance of not being greedy like I definitely was, and just accepting some unopposed damage for the sake of killing the minion. Taking a few random hits is completely fine. Letting him get the kill before you is a lot less fine for various reasons. Of course, once you defeat Der Flushshoots, you are given 4 equally powerful buffs to choose from, and in case you couldn't tell, equally powerful was said with the heaviest of sarcasm. Pendant of Nostalgia is absolutely terrible. 10 poise potency to 3 allies on combat start is literally nothing compared to the benefit you should have already gotten from Nebulizer when you had the chance if you really wanted to run poise. Fell Bullet Deluge is a pretty funny concept, but really impractical. Yes, HP Manipulation increases the damage dealt by it, but it also makes it harder to die. And just as a general rule of thumb, roughly 110 to 150 damage is way worse than just attacking with increased damage. Festival of Blood is only good for Blood Fiend IDs, and even if Blood Fiends are a really good team to run in the next section, there is still only really one option. The Lone Gunman, which raises the first deployed ally's min and max speed by 1, and replaces a skill 1 with a skill 3. Yeah, seriously, it's just not even a competition. But to get into the exact ins and outs of how best to use this buff, we have to first look at what's upcoming in Section 3. First, and most importantly, you are no longer ID locked. All of your IDs become available after Section 2, and that's particularly good because there is big overlap with Section 2 in terms of good IDs to use, because Lust and Envy are your best bets out of these sins or damage types to build around. Funny enough, your damage type doesn't actually matter too much, though Pierce is best for the Envy Pecatillum, even if not by too much. It's more important to just build around any one damage type, since some of the buffs later down the line will be much more useful if you have lots of one damage type in particular. For that same reason, building around one Sin Affinity is also good. I would personally recommend Envy, but that's only if you took Refracted Charge earlier in the Railway, since the synergy is really good. For that setup, it's kind of the usual suspects when you think of strong Envy skills and generally good IDs. The Warp Duo in particular pay off extremely well, and Zvyishmael, Wild Hunt Heathcliff, and Multicrack Faust are once again good options. But I think the single safest ID to bring is actually Princess of La Mancha Rodian, and it's for a very simple reason. Her counter. Bleed is the name of the game for this section, and while Bloody Banquet does everything Roja's counter does and more, there's a decent chance you plan to take Bloody Banquet after the Dulcinea fight. And so Roja helps you reduce some damage across the board there, while also just being an excellent ID that works great with this Envy team, especially with the Hexnail Ego being perfectly fueled by her. And her AoE on her skill 3 is useful for the Envy Pekatulum, since it's likely you'll have it charged up going into that wave. Even better, Princess of La Mancha Rodion works with an Envy setup and a Lust team setup, which is slightly better than the Envy setup for the Blood Fiend trio, though ever so slightly worse for the Pekatulum. I'd say Lust is probably the better setup overall, not considering any other buffs, but it really shouldn't matter too much. The Blood Fiend IDs plus Ring Yi Song is a pretty good baseline for a Lust team, and Kurokumo Heathcliff and Ishmael would also fit in nicely, even if it makes building around a single damage type a bit annoying. Beyond just basic team building though, we need to think about which IDs are best to use the Lone Gunman buff on, and there's barely any bad options, but I'd say the priority is more about getting rid of bad skill 1s rather than adding particularly great skill 3s. A mix of the two is obviously best, and for my runs I have used Multicrack Faust, Warbrioshu, and Cinq Merceau. Multicrack's skill 1 isn't terrible, but it doesn't really do anything, whereas her skill 3 is her nuke skill and her main way of ramping up. If it was Lust or Envy, it'd be perfect, but it's still very good. And anyways, it inflicts Envy Fragility, so there's still synergy there. Warbrioshu has pretty obvious logic behind it, since her skill 1 is pretty bad clash-wise, and her skill 3 is incredible. Even if she may lack charge to fully use it at times, it is still better than having a skill 1. Cinq Merceau may not have Envy or Lust synergy, but his rolls plus Regret plus Focus Attack make him really good for the Dulcinea fight, and the other Dulcinea fight, considering we need to clash on her same counter slot basically every turn, so giving him more speed and more skill 3s to potentially get off the reuse works out pretty well. If you don't feel the need to run Dulcinea Roja due to having Bloody Banquet or whatever other factors, I'd say a Multicrack Faust with the Lone Gunman buff leaning into Envy and potentially blunt damage is your second best support ID option, but a lot of the team building in this railway just has to be in your hands due to the nature of the buffs. So long as you build into one damage type and one Sin Affinity, that isn't Sloth anyway, decently enough, you shouldn't struggle here. So now we are at the first of 2 times you'll be seeing Dulcinea this railway, and while I would love to confidently say, oh, everyone watching this video has gotten past Canto 7, so they surely know how to deal with the Dulcinea fight, sadly I know deep down in my cold, dark, and very cupid heart that I cannot say that because a good percentage of you just brute forced past this node when you did it initially, and it probably took you like 5 tries. Now luckily, if you still have some PTSD, I need you to remember that we are buffed to hell and back in terms of our sustain and or damage due to the buffs we've picked. So all we need to do is deal with the most basic of basic mechanics here, and that is just clash against her counter, win, kill her friends, and then kill her. And that's all it does, is your top priority skill to clash against first in a turn if possible. This will remove basically all Blooming Thorns from Dulcinea, and therefore remove her annoying bleed application on hit. If you've already taken Bloody Banquet at this point, congratulations, you don't even have to win against this counter to get past the fight, but you still definitely should try. The people without Bloody Banquet, so long as you prioritize not falling behind and letting Dulcinea deal massive damage back to you, everything should be smooth sailing if you keep killing the Blood Bags and Blood Fiends while dealing with her big attacks that she uses whenever her Imperfect Parade gets high enough. The Dulcinea fight is usually quite the slog, but luckily we are in Railway, and due to our buffs, if you manage to defeat all of her backup dancers and trigger a stagger via this passive, we can implement our same strategy of chain staggering her to get a lot of damage, though by the time she has no more proper backup, the fight should basically be solved. This chain stagger can straight up kill her, and even if it doesn't kill her, it will stop the annoying cycle of taking free bleed damage for basically 3 whole turns. The finale skill is the main time you might need Dulcinea Roja's counter, a healing ego, or, just watching it go away with Bloody Banquet, but again, 36 damage via bleed shouldn't be able to stop you at this point. My last piece of advice for this fight would be to watch out for the Blood Fiend minions, since despite being backup and theoretically super easy fodder, they actually clash pretty well and are surprisingly tanky, especially if you've not taken life or death at this point. The worst part of this fight really is just getting the ball rolling SP-wise, and even then, there's plenty of ego you can use to make the beginning not nearly as bad if you don't want to flip coins, lose, and then call the game rigged. 8 new buffs are added to the merry-go-round after Dulcinea, 7 of which are very straightforward Sin Affinity damage buffers, and 1 of which is absolutely deranged to take. Power Roulette has got to be the funniest buff added to this railway simply because why would you ever take this? Outside of just for fun, this seems terrible for actually winning, since you could just get entirely screwed over because of RNG, and not just innate Limbus RNG, this is RNG that you chose to bring into the game over an actually reliable or good buff, no less. Regardless, I would take the last of the Holy Trinity here, Life or Death, HP Manipulation, or especially Bloody Banquet. Since Envy Pecatella are up next, the Clash Power downside of the Sin Affinity buffs is quite a bit scarier than it will be if we take it just before Blood Fiend Trio. If your Sin Affinities are very uniform, then taking that corresponding buff is probably worth it, since your damage will increase by a ton, but outside of that, we just want to take the really good buffs while we have a chance. Luckily, the Blood Fiend plus 2 lost L-Corp employees Envy Pecatellum Wave should be the easiest of the railway. You have max SP, and all of the buffs we could ever want at this point, and their HP just doesn't stack up. They don't have RNG Unbreakables, or ridiculous turn 1 Clash Power and Speed. In fact, Bloody Banquet basically means this is just a place to heal up the chip damage we took from Dulcinea. Once again, AoE Blunt, Slash, or even Pierce Ego make very quick work here, and the fact that it is just 6 enemies means we should prioritize killing anything we can on turn 1. I feel like talking too in-depth about this stage would give the wrong impression that it is way more of a threat than it actually is. I suppose if there's any enemy to focus on first, it would be Manager Dawn, just because her HP is so low and her stagger threshold is so high. But also, lucky for us, Envy destroys Otis, Ryoshu, and Rodion, and Lust takes down Merceau and Otis. It doesn't matter how you slice it, this wave should just be cleaned up in under 4 turns, unless you've just avoided every single damage buff under the sun, in which case, why even bother watching a guide video if you're just gonna ignore the advice? Now, despite having a ton of buff options to choose from, including one I definitely didn't forget about until now editing this video, don't take this, you're not a coward, we are indeed just going to take our Sin Affinity boosting buff and head right on into Blood Fiend Trio, who... look... I think this fight is just really easy. Even outside of Railway, I never had much of an issue here, and if you got through Dulcinea without many issues, then it will be the same situation here. The strategy for this fight is the same as it's always been. Kill the Barber first, then Dulcinea, and finally, the Priest. If there's any wave in this Railway that just doesn't stack up in terms of HP, it is this one. While roughly 1200, 1400, and 1800 HP should sound scary, it's just not, considering we are often dealing at least 60% more damage than normal with our Sin Affinity boosting buff, and even more once they've been staggered. If your Sin Affinity of choice was Lust, then this fight is genuinely unfair. That said, the enemies also have a lot of buffs, mostly to their damage, and that's why we want to focus down the Barber first, since her attacks are easily the scariest if she's allowed to get them off, and she'll even try to go for an insta-kill if you happen to be coming in with an ally below 30% HP. Luckily, the first few turns of the fight are very simple, so healing up if need be while focusing your big damage attacks into Barber until she's staggered is for free. If you want, you can pull the same chain staggering trick on Barber once you hit the first stagger bar, but you should just have the capacity to straight up kill her, and you should take that chance. Once again with Dulcinea, we need to be clashing her counter if she uses it, but despite being part of her skills list, I don't think she can use it during this fight. I scrubbed through all my footage and I didn't find anything, so the finale is once again the worst thing she can do to us, and even then, she'll be dead a couple turns after using it, since she doesn't have a million protection to save her from being nuked down. And then the Priest, who literally wants to die so badly. I mean, look at the amount of fragile he gains for just existing and losing clashes. He exists solely to increase Blood Feast. That doesn't matter, because his teammates that would have made use of it are dead before it can ever matter. I'd love to feign and pretend like I have better advice for you, but I don't. If you've built your team even remotely well, these guys should get completely run over. Bloody Banquet just hard counters any downsides of getting hit, and your damage is too much. The last buffs this railway offers us don't leave much room for interesting discussion. The 3 damage type buffs are all equally good for their respective team compositions. High risk is kinda bad comparatively, since not getting coin power and giving the enemy +2 coin power is just a bit too risky for only slightly more payoff, kind of. Comfy is not even that bad, but it would be actively good if the Terminus boss was actually really fast, but it's not, so it's really only a buff to IDs with speed conditionals, and a buff to max HP, which we definitely don't need. So once again, there's really only one option. Taking the buff that corresponds to your most common damage type, and then we're finally at the final fight of the railway. Historically, I like to give a little bit of reverence to Terminus bosses. Sign of Roses is great, Spiral of Contempt is genuinely fantastic from an atmospheric perspective, and King of Binds has some stupidly good boss music, and then we have, 400 Roses, which has a cool theme, I guess, and was ripped straight out of Cuphead, but then lost all semblance of difficulty in the transfer. Now, I know, that's a lot of HP, but we've already made this thing weak to our most common Sin Affinity and damage type, as well as countering everything bleed-related that it wants to do via Bloody Banquet. And while it does have some coin power and clash power from our downsides, now we have coin power on our skills from our favoritist damage type. And even if anything 400 Roses wants to do to us is scary, your ego resource stockpile should be in no short supply. The only thing I would do immediately if you're scared is change your resistances off of Lust or Gluttony if possible, since those are the only 2 sins this thing is going to be consistently using. Once every 3 turns from the start of this wave, you'll be met with this abnormality check where all of your training is going to pay off. You see this shit? That lowers the abnormality's offenses at the cost of HP and increasing its defenses? Yeah, this shit is a trap. Giving it a little bit of blood makes every ally lose 10% of their max HP in exchange for 2 attack power down and 2 protection on 400 Roses. 2 attack power down will never save you more than 10% max HP on 2 allies, let alone all 6. And the moderate blood trade is even worse. The bottom option, I honestly don't even know what it does because I can't select it, but the top option is likely always the best choice. In exchange for giving 400 Roses 1 attack power up, it gets a Fragile, and you lose no percentage of your max HP. This is far and away the best option, to the point it kinda baffles me that the others even exist. At some point during the fight, the Rose will yell and get angry, and then it will do nothing actually impactful, and then it will die in like 3 turns. Trust me, I wish it was actually climactic, but with the optimal way of doing things, Section 3 is an absolute breeze, and 400 Roses especially is just fundamentally walled by Bloody Banquet, or even potentially just spamming Dulcinea Roja's counter. Just like with Bloodfiend Trio, I wish I had more advice to offer, but I really don't beyond general tips that I've repeated far too much, even in a video as long as this one. Once you've proven that no, in fact, not every rose has its thorns, you're done with Refraction Railway 5. And while that is the end of my extremely brief overview and guide to this railway, I do want to talk about my personal thoughts on it, even if you can probably already tell that I think Section 3 was way too easy, especially considering how notorious final sections of railways usually are. I know that Dulcinea and Bloodfiend Trio are pretty infamous fights in their own right, but the existence of Bloody Banquet, alongside the absurd level of power that is easily accessible from the merry-go-round of buffs, made them into a non-issue. And even if having MD-level power in a railway was fun, being stupidly strong is why I don't enjoy MD as a game mode, and actually struggling is why I enjoy Railway. Envy Peccatillum are the main thing that make this thing actually tricky in some places, and even then, I'm unsure of how to feel about Envy Peccatillum being our main source of actual difficulty going forward. I think I still enjoyed it here, since getting through them is really satisfying, but the abnormality fights need to stack up. And for the past 2 railways, they really have not. Railway 3 had the best abnormality lineup in my opinion, since Gossi had a fun gimmick, Ardor Blossom Moth was about chip damage and had one attack that was so comically large, it was genuinely a little funny, and Spiral was an interesting puzzle fight that didn't give away its secrets if you didn't experiment. By comparison, Sleeping Bag is okay, but that's mostly because I enjoy the aesthetic. Durflush, whatever shoots, did actually scratch that abnormality fight itch, and then 400 Roses was so laughably easy that it made me forget it was a Terminus boss. The choice to include both Dulcinea and Bloodfiend Trio in one section was additionally disappointing, because I think the fights feel pretty similar, but if there's one thing I do have to praise, it's the ID locking and the fact they experimented with railway buffs again at all. On the subject of locking in your IDs, I only wish you could check the section's weaknesses ahead of time so that you won't use teams at the exact wrong time and feel like it was bullshit. And even if the buffs were overpowered and hard countered what the railway was trying to do at the end, I will almost always enjoy it when I'm forced to make an informed decision and weigh pros and cons. I think with a bit more fine-tuning, this could be a great direction to take railways on the whole, since it objectively makes them more enticing as replayable content. But okay, I could go on and talk even more about Railway and my thoughts on it, but if you know anything about my thoughts on Railway as a game mode, you know what this would evolve into. So instead, I'll just say thank you for watching, and thank you for 50,000 subscribers. I promise I will try to properly earn that number in the upcoming months. This video ends now.